So when men are doing TRT or HRT, eventually I guess common knowledge is that you kind of need it forever, whether you're cycling or not, but that you'll never be able to kind of reproduce that baseline again, like your natural baseline, because you weren't using it for so long. And then I heard you on a podcast and you were comparing birth control to like HRT for women, which I thought was so fascinating because it's never positioned like that. And you give it to minors, right? Most of the time they start when they're like 13, 14, 15 usually, and it's usually pitched for some bogus reasons, but it's not what I would call like ethical or even conscious consent, because they don't give you potential side effects, they don't give you the alternatives, they just give you the benefits of the one thing. And to me that doesn't seem like an honest way or like an honest transaction with a layperson. Like I feel like there needs to be full disclosure, but there's not. So you give this medication to a minor and they're on it for over a decade. If it's similar to a man kind of being on T, is the consequence potentially the same? Like, is it kind of like disrupts the hormones potentially lifelong for the female, or is there a way to get back to a healthy place where you're making the hormones back internally?
Yeah, with men on TRT, because the preface of a man getting on TRT is in general, if they are actually a clinically viable candidate, like on paper and symptomatically, they actually need it to function. The likelihood that you would get back to some level of function after coming off that is supportive of high quality function at all is essentially impossible, because you wouldn't have got on it to begin with if you weren't subfunctional to begin with. So it's a bit of a disparity between if you needed it versus didn't when you got on it. Because for women, when they get on birth control, they don't need it. Like, they don't need to take a replacement of hormones at 16 years old or whatever. For men getting on TRT at like 30 or 35 or whatever, there is definitely a disparity between some of them need it and some of them are just using it to optimize, kind of thing. So
Mhm.
individuals that really needed it, yeah, you could come off and potentially recover to whatever suboptimal natural amount you had previously. It's just even less likely because as you age, it's going to decline anyways. You were subfunctional when you started the TRT. So if you came off 10 years later, best case scenario is you recovered some like lower amount than you had before you got on it to begin with, probably. If you were somebody who didn't need the TRT and you got on it, you could potentially restore function. It would just be a arduous recovery process, likely, because you have had, depending on the amount of exposure, like the duration of it, you have had lack of like the organ itself has not been functioning for this long. So recovering to baseline is difficult to expect. But this is again where nuance comes in, because if you're on HCG and FSH this whole time, maintaining testicular volume and function, your transition period to natural function, if you came off the TRT, might be a lot smoother than a guy who wasn't using that and has the most atrophied shriveled testicles ever. Like, that's going to be a completely different process. So it's not that you can't recover, it just depends on the context in which, like, where you stand on that spectrum. For women getting on birth control at a young age who have otherwise like peaking hormones, they are basically suppressing themselves to a point where they are now reliant on a synthetic replacement of a synthetic estrogen and progestin, rather than having their natural estradiol and progesterone being produced. And testosterone also gets, crushed into the ground too, unfortunately. So it absolutely could be the case that if they're on it for 10, 15, whatever years, and then they want to have a kid, that recovery process is probably not going to be the smoothest. Now, fortunately for women, recovering certain hormones, I wouldn't necessarily say it's like easier. That would be probably an incorrect statement to say, but their their hormone levels are not like, I don't know, trying to get back to a peak testosterone level as a female might be a less arduous undertaking than a guy, because they don't rely on it as much to function. Whereas, like, they do rely on testosterone, it's an important hormone, but they don't need to produce 600 nanogram per deciliter to feel good. And again, that number depends on the individual. They only need 10, 1/10 of that to function the same. Like, a lot of women are just accustomed to functioning like castrated, essentially. I'm not
Mhm.
saying that that's like an excuse for,
Yeah.
staying on it or coming off and not having as hard of a recovery process. But in general, the delta of, I don't know, like hormones required to support a state that you could otherwise function on in an androgen environment, at least for women, is seemingly lower than men, to where maybe the recovery process isn't as dramatic for that. But certainly, if they're coming off of hormones they needed to support any sort of estrogen functions, progesterone related functions, coming off of it, you're going to have some sort of period where it's clearing out of your system and you have to recover natural function, and probably won't feel great during that process. And how long or arduous that process is could be dependent on multiple factors like lifestyle quality, diet, sleep hygiene, etc. Because women who have poor lifestyle and diet, like they may never recover. There's some women who have crushed libidos, and then they try and get off and it never went back to baseline ever.
Mhm.
Like that is an outcome that is certainly possible. So I would say in general, they typically, under the right circumstances of healthy supporting infrastructure of diet principles, etc., are likely to recover some level of natural function. The level to which they get, though, is going to be dependent on all those variables. And it certainly is more difficult because, like, we just discussed, you've been essentially neglecting certain organ systems and signaling cascades for a decade plus. And now your body has to recover that to baseline somehow, when over half your life you have not had that functional. So yeah, I think it definitely does permanent, especially brain chemistry. I think it definitely can be impactful on a somewhat permanent basis, potentially for women too. If you
Wow.
are half your life, especially in your developing years, being exposed to like synthetic drugs to support your like brain development, and it's like you have an inadequate amount of bioidentical estradiol and progesterone, you're relying on the synthetic progestin, the synthetic ethinyl estradiol, your testosterone's in the toilet, it will certainly impact your brain health, neurological state, mental well-being, potentially mood volatility. Like some women even have different preference of sexual, like their partner selection when they're on birth control versus not. So yeah, I
Because
think
you
there's
can't
that.
pick up on the pheromones.
Yeah.